And I think the best example of that is actually in America, which is Bernie Sanders right now. Because if you listen to what he's saying and a lot of what he says, it's quite left wing for the Democratic Party, like in America. You know, it's actually exceptionally left wing, particularly in the last 2 decades. And I think what that actually does is, in a lot of ways, it legitimizes what a lot of people like us are always talking about. Because when you have in a situation where we are now, where if I go up onto someone on the street and start talking to them about anti-capitalism, most of them will just think I'm one of those crazy loony left people that the Daily Mail always writes about, that doesn't really understand the reality of the situation and has these kind of grand utopian ideals of how to change society. But then the minute you've got someone like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders standing up for office, basically saying they are revolutionaries. I mean, Bernie Sanders openly says he is a communist. He's a socialist. Sorry? Socialist, yeah, socialist. I think that's a big deal, because that starts shifting people's mindsets. All of a sudden, people who might be actually quite receptive to those ideas but are turned off by the label or by the kind of, I don't know, informality of it, all of a sudden they're going, actually, that's actually a legitimate policy that a politician can go up and say, and it's totally, it works, or at least I think it works. So I think there's actually a kind of, as I said, like a softer benefit of having revolutionaries trying to run for office. Now, I don't think we should all immediately start running for office or anything like that. But having someone doing that definitely gives that kind of legitimacy boost that I think we're lacking a lot of the time in kind of mainstream political thought.
So I just wanted to respond to that. I think it's definitely useful to have for there to be a platform for radical politics, but at the same time, I think it can obfuscate the kind of the changes that need to happen. So, for example, take Jeremy Corbyn. I think revolutionaries are discussing how to kind of relate to this, and I think there's a sense of potentially Jeremy Corbyn doing well in the Labour leadership election could potentially invigorate a kind of a radical politics taking place on a grassroots level. I'm not totally convinced about how much this is the case. Like, I think there's a kind of a sort of part of the reason that I think Labour, clearly it's not a left-wing party in any sense, but there's part of the reason that it didn't do well in the election is there's a kind of sense at which, on the ground, a kind of radical politics based around community organising, based around building relationships with people most disenfranchised, whether that be around housing or around kind of a kind of politics based on practical solidarity on the ground. And I think that shift needs to take place, and the relationship that shift has to the platform for radical politics, I think, is a kind of ongoing question that I think we need to tackle. So it's not, the platform is not enough, it's actually a change in how we do things on the ground.
Building on what's been said about this point about Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders sort of building scope for public support for radical policies and whatever, the actual policies that people like Jeremy Corbyn are campaigning on, things like nationalising the railways, higher taxes on the rich, that sort of thing, they're already supported by the majority of the public. If you look at the opinion polls, even the majority of Conservative voters think we should have higher taxes on the rich, that we should nationalise the energy companies. There's a few issues where it's not the case, such as immigration, where the public's got a more right-wing view in general. But for the vast bulk, particularly of the more economic of these policies, the public opinion is already with them. So I don't know how far the argument that they're shifting public opinion actually holds.
Well, on that direct point, I've seen all these polls as well, and they're incredibly heartening when we read them. Yet, at the very least, there's some sort of block. There's an ideological block in there. People say they want it. They say they want all these things, and yet they don't vote for them,
but it's
and they
not
don't
on
back
offer.
them. Well,
no, it is.
35% of people don't vote. That's more than the number that voted for any of the political parties.
I agree, and I agree that there should be more left-wing political parties, and I agree with all this, but I just think that there's also scope for mobilizing. There's always a scope for mobilizing people and pulling them leftwards, but I wanted to add the caveat that again, this has to remain the secondary part of the strategy, because we've seen when the left puts its whole hope in electing somebody, it inevitably fails. Either they lose the election or they win the election and can't do anything, and this demobilizes the movement and makes it pessimistic and weak. And I mean, as one example, the United States in '72, the Democratic Party nominated a man who was running on a platform, George McGovern, who's running on a platform of essentially nationalizing everything, doubling the tax rate, enforcing gender equality, you know, legalizing all the drugs, all the wonderful, wonderful things that we'd all like to see. But everyone simply seemed to have decided that they could just work in his campaign and then they'd win the election, and that would be that, and America would become essentially a socialist country with very progressive social views. And when that wasn't the case, when he lost by a landslide to Richard Nixon of all people, it demobilized a lot of the radical movement that had existed in 68, 69, 70, 71, and the people who had gone out and challenged the Democratic Party in 68 at their convention. And so, while I think there's certainly a scope for this electoral activity, and I really like Bernie Sanders, and I think like a Jeremy Corbyn is a positive thing, and these are all positive things in the movement, that kind of distance and that skepticism and the maintaining of the priority on street politics and grassroots politics is essential in order to make that part of the strategy of revolution rather than a false end that will then just lead to disappointment and demobilization.